Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and we are getting a brand new patch of 9.05 very soon. But afterwards comes the patch 9.1. First major patch for World of Warcraft with new content, new zones, dungeons and raids, as well as a variety of class changes that Blizzard simply didn't get into, and Covenant changes that Blizzard also didn't get into. My honest thoughts is I actually think Blizzard is waiting to put the stuff to PTR and get a lot more community effort and feedback from how Covenants play, how Soulbinds play, and all these things. So I think we're actually not going to hear about it for quite a while. However, I wanted to still take a look myself at the current Covenant abilities we have and how potentially Blizzard could in the future alter them to be played better for patch 9.1. So let's take a look at all the Rogue Covenant abilities. Covering everything from the Covenants is kind of difficult because the Soulbinds, like for Kyrian for example, Pelagos, Clea, Mechanicos, all of them have to work for a variety of different classes and different specs. For Rogues, however, the only thing that's truly unique to us really is the Conduits, but also the Covenant abilities. We have 4 of them, like every other class, and all of them are varied in a variety of different ways. So in this video, I'm primarily going to focus on these specific abilities. First of all, I want to talk a bit about low impact versus high impact. What are some of the low impact abilities and high impact? When I say high impact, I really mean like Night Fae Mage, Night Fae Warlock, Night Fae Hunter, or really any other class that's Night Fae, because a lot of them seem to be really good for Night Fae. I feel like rogue abilities are pretty low impact, as it doesn't really make too much of a difference which one we end up playing. While for a class like, I don't know, Frost Mage for example, you kind of have to be Venthyr as that is your best choice. Elemental Shaman, you really would want to be a Necrolord because the advantage you get for being a Necrolord Shaman Elemental is just so much more massive than like a Night Fae Elemental Shaman, you know? For rogues though, most of our abilities can be swapped out pretty easily. We can basically play whatever covenant we want to. Let's say you're doing Mythic Pluses with a group, and it helps when everybody's a different covenant in Mythic Pluses, so you can take advantage of certain Mythic Plus dungeon benefits. Rogues, let's say if you don't have a Necrolord for your group, a rogue could switch to a Necrolord and you would gain more benefit and not nearly as much loss as some of the other covenants and classes if they were to switch the covenant choice. The only ideas that I could really come up with a way to make Covenant abilities better for rogues is to make them from low impact to high impact. Give them extra mechanics, or really let them dive into some of the aspects that they kind of dip their toe into but don't really go super far in, and try to kind of really emphasize those aspects. But that would mean transforming a lot of the abilities from low impact to high impact, which wouldn't be my preference, but made for a lot of interesting suggestions. So since we are in the Kyrian domain of Bastion, let's start off with the Kyrian ability. The ability itself is going to be Echo and Reprimand, and I have a couple of different notes here to kind of collect my thoughts a little bit better. There's some pros to Echo and Reprimand. First of all, the Mogs and Kyrians look absolutely fantastic, and the Vial is a really good ability to use in PvE and PvP if you feel like you need that extra sipping up heal. The pros of Echo and Reprimand are, though, it's a pretty decent damage and ability. Like, it actually does pretty decent damage all by itself. It also has a very cheap energy cost. I mean, 10 energy is basically no energy at all. It grants 2 combo points, which I think is pretty nice. You also have a combo point minigame, which can sometimes reward you good damage. Blade Flurry also cleaves with this ability, and if I line up my character properly, and I press Blade Flurry without auto-attacking the enemy, and I hit him with the Echoing, you can see that Echoing does have a cleave to it. So there are some playstyles for Outlaw, I guess is the other specs as well, but mostly for Outlaw, so it does have this natural cleave aspect to it. The conduit for this ability is not really anything interesting though. It's good, but it's not anything crazy. The max level version, at least for 9.1 or before 9.1, gives you a extra damage on your Echo and Reprimand. So the conduit itself doesn't change the ability too much. It just increases the damage, which I guess is fine, but it's kind of a boring conduit, as I think conduit should maybe do a little bit more to make this ability spicier. But, you know, we'll be talking about that when we talk about how the abilities are affected. So what are the cons of going Echo and Reprimand? The minigame of this ability, the common point thing, is completely ignored, and it's actually recommended in rogue guides to ignore it and not alter your rotation at all unless you accidentally land on that common point minigame thing. When you press the ability, you get an anima charge common point. If you use a finisher at that anima charge common point, it'll act as if it's like a 7 common point finisher. So normally my 6 common point dispatch would do like 5,100 damage. A 7 common point quote-unquote finisher would do, how much does that do actually? It did about 4,000, so I guess the enemy does have armor, so it is reduced by armor. It's supposed to empower the damage of your next finisher, which is a nice, fun minigame at first, but most rogues recommend you just ignore it completely. How randomly rogues generate their common points, whether you're subtlety, assassination, or outlaw, you really can't play into it. Like if you get Echo and Reprimand, for example, you're not gonna go for, let's say, Sinister Strike and then pistol shot just so you can gain that common point. You're just gonna ignore that playstyle completely. Eventually you'll end up landing on the common points that it needs you. So at 4 common points, eventually you'll land there, and then you will actually utilize the minigame. But otherwise you actually just ignore the minigame completely. So I have 4 common points, this way I would utilize it, but it's an aspect of this whole ability that gets completely ignored, and a lot of players even finding it annoying to play with. Another disadvantage to Echo and Reprimand is does not work for abilities like Slice and Dice. To treat my Slice and Dice as a 7 common point finisher, I feel like would be amazing. So then you could have a long Slice and Dice without having to worry about it at all. Some of the things that I noticed when it comes to thinking about Echo and Reprimand and messing around with it a little bit, the interplay within finishers sounds like an interesting idea, you know, the minigame and whatnot. But I wonder if there's a way to enhance this ability in other ways that doesn't have to do with the actual minigame part itself. Like the idea of being able to enhance your finishers like longer Slice and Dice, or maybe your finishers do more damage, I think is a really cool concept. Also, is there a way to make this ability more consistent? Because, well, the common point anima charge thing, I mean, sometimes they get the value, but not really. It doesn't really have super crazy impact. That one finisher you use it on will not really make it or break it for your rotation for the most part. So it kind of just ends up being an ability you just press, and then if you land on the common point, you press it as well, and you don't think much about it. What if it was a way for you to empower finishers? There have been other abilities in the past, like artifact weapons and such, that allowed you finisher empowerment resources of some sort. For example, I like the idea of Echo and Reprimand making your next finisher function as if it's 7 common points, but I would love it for work on abilities like Slice and Dice, but also make it more consistent for your finishers as well. So what if they made it when you use Echo and Reprimand, it'll kind of like amp up your finishers, like the next 3 finishers, something along those lines. My idea was, and this is nothing perfect, but what if it made things like Slice and Dice and Rupture last longer so you don't need to refresh them nearly as much? Or maybe things like your Between the Eyes for Outlaw. It makes certain finishers do, I don't know, maybe more damage. Kind of like a Deeper Stratagem that you would get as a talent, but like a limited version of Deeper Stratagem. So then this way you'll make it where after using Echo and Reprimand, maybe let's say your next 3 finishers are enhanced in some way or another. It could be either with damage or duration, so you don't have to worry about refreshing them nearly as much. But that's some of my initial thoughts that I had with Echo in terms of what could be done. I think it's a decent ability by itself, but it definitely I think could be more interesting. The minigame aspect, I was actually surprised to hear how many people really dislike this mechanic. The next comment we'll be talking about is the Necrolord Covenant, the one that actually I think has the least play of all specs of rogues, or I guess for rogues in general when it comes to the data that's been collected in the past. Taking a look at the rogues, we're going to be talking about Serrated Bone Spike, the ability. It's actually kind of a nice ability, and I remember it being really overpowered back in the alpha and the beta, but after they nerfed it, it feels like just about nobody's playing the spec nearly as much. But I think this is a spec that still has a bit of play. It's actually rose to a bit of prominence in Mythic Pluses because of the AoE capabilities of the soul binds and such. But let's take a closer look at the Serrated Bone Spike, the ability itself. In fact, actually Necrolords are getting quite a bit of buff, so I wonder what the buff to Fleshcraft might do for rogues, having that 20% DR while you're channeling it. I wonder if that'll become a better ability for Mythic Pluses or PvP or raiding at some point. Serrated Bone Spike is an interesting ability. It has a 30-yard range, so when it comes to rogue ranged abilities, I think it has the most range for all of rogue's abilities. So you can kind of use it from quite a distance, which can be sometimes nice. The ability itself has a pretty low energy cost, only costing 15 energy, so you can kind of use it quite often. Ability will also come with a perma bleed, so as soon as you put it on an enemy, as long as they don't heal or die, they'll have a bleed that takes every around 3 seconds. So the ability is going to be stuck in the enemy. You can even see a graphic of that spike through the enemy's head. It'll just kind of be chilling there for the time being. This ability also generates common points for every active spike out, meaning that if I have, let's say, one enemy spiked and I have no common points, I throw another spike, instead of generating 1 common point, it will generate 2 because there's 1 spike out. Let's say, for example, I get rid of my common points real quickly, so we have 2 spikes out and we have a third enemy. I'm gonna spike him. That generates 3 common points because there's only 2 spikes active. So with 3 spikes active, I throw another spike, that should be 4 common points. So if you can somehow get a bunch of enemies to have a bunch of these debuffs, so at least like 5 and you're playing deeper stratagem, then a single bone spike will generate 6 combo points, which gives it a unique aspect. If the target dies with the bone spike, you also refund a charge of bone spike, so even though it's a 30-second recharge, you actually can get it back pretty quickly. There is some synergies to this ability with talents, as it is a pretty inexpensive ability, and there are talents like, for example, for Outlaw Dreadblades that will work and give you full combo points off of a single bone spike. When you throw a bone spike, you get full combo points. With the spike, can go right into finisher, bone spike, bone spike, finisher. So if there are any kind of covenant things or class abilities that have any kind of like playstyle to it, then it will be a serrated bone spike that has any kind of this interesting, intricate playstyle. This ability, as you can see, is pretty great for multi-dotting. If, let's say, I'm getting combat with this guy, so my details can constantly track just how much damage I'm doing. I mean, the dot damage is kind of all over the place. Something in Outlaw Rogue doesn't really do that much is dots, but as I'm auto-attacking an enemy, just about everybody around me is kind of melting to all these dots. So if you have multiple targets to dot up, that's just extra free damage on top of whatever other damage you're doing. Conduit of this ability is kind of lame in some cases. It might be better at way higher levels, but right now all it does is serrated bone spikes bleed has a 48% chance to deal this damage a second time. So as I get in combat with the trained dummies and my details kind of keeps tracking, you'll see that there's a damage overtime component of bone spike. Then if I were to press bone spike, you would see there's actually like impact damage when I first throw it, and then it has a calculation of an extra dot second tick. So the initial dot itself does about the same damage of 234, and then the tick also does, you know, double the damage with a chance for it to crit and whatnot. So it can kind of be good if you get a really high chance for it. I mean, with the conduit right now, it's a 50% chance that it hits again, but you also should know that the ability damage is quite low in comparison to all the other covenant abilities. This one is very, very low. And that's going to come down to the cons. The ability for this damage in terms of the other covenants, this one is noticeably far lower than everything else. It has a lot more interplay in terms of your soul binds, for example, like if you end up playing Emily soul bind and you get the lead by example ability. Serrated bone spike increases your agility by 5% and up to 4 nearby allies primary stab by 2%. For 5 seconds, you gain 2% additional agility for each ally affected, so this can give you quite a big agility buff inside of Mythic Pluses, for example, when you use Bone Spike. It also provides primary stats to your allies, which you can use quite often. Since Bone Spike, you have 3 charges, you can basically, for a full combustion of your Fire Mage, give them a little bit extra intellect so they do more damage. So there's a lot of interplay with this ability, how it can work with groups and such. And then, of course, the talents that we talked about, but by itself, the ability is just kind of, it's fun to press, but I think it redefines the idea of low impact ability in some sense. So basically what I'm trying to say is this covenant ability does just about everything well that it can do, except for the actual damage part of it. The damage is pretty low. There's a lot of this cool stuff that makes it fun to play this ability and press it. The damage itself isn't that great, but the aspect of actually pressing the ability and it does things, that's really, really enjoyable to me. I feel like if we were to, let's say, make some kind of change to this ability, I would add some kind of more satisfaction, because this ability feels fun to press, but does it do good damage? Not really. And I feel like that alone can take away a lot of the components from like wanting to press this ability, because for the energy cost and the damage that it does, it feels like it's kind of on a lower priority because the damage doesn't feel satisfying at all. It's a great ability to press because it's so easy, but in some cases, sometimes I feel like I probably just shouldn't even press Bone Spike unless I have nothing else to press at all. So my suggestion for this ability would be something different. I would like for this ability to do more damage, but because of how readily available it is with 3 charges and the fact that it's a permanent bleed, I think is what really holds the damage from feeling satisfying. Maybe Blizzard could do a couple things to give this ability more damage, but you would have to give up some aspects like permanent bleed is lost. Give it like a set duration, but make that bleed really pop. Or maybe give you less charges of bone spikes, like start with 2. Take away 1 charge, but make it so that when you do spike, it does quite a bit of damage, and the bleed, while no longer permanent, actually now has more damage tied to it. The one aspect I really wouldn't want to go away if we were to change this ability is the combo point playstyle, where you have multiple bleeds and you can get yourself more combo points as you keep spiking enemies. So what if they made it that the proc for this ability is while the bleed is on the enemy, you have a chance to gain another spike of the bone spike or another charge. Start with 2 charges, bleed up a couple enemies, and as you put bleeds and dots or AoE enemies down, you have a chance to generate more spikes, which generates you more combo points. And maybe even change the conduit, so if, let's say, you were to change the ability, so as you hit an enemy with a spike, you have a chance to gain a charge spike, you can make the conduit maybe give you a higher chance for you to get the spike, or maybe buff the damage of the dot. And if you were to make it a non-perma dot, you could actually probably amp up the damage of the bleed to make it a little bit more high impact. I feel like this is not really enough changes though to make this ability super high impact in our rotation, to alter it in crazy ways, but it would be enough where this ability still does the fun things that you do like, but those fun things become a lot bigger value than what it has right now. Because this ability does everything else cool except for the actual damage aspect of it, but all the common point building and the buffing and the augmentation and the common points are all super fun. But if you were to, let's say, keep those fun aspects but find ways to maybe sacrifice small aspects of this ability for more damage, so then when you do press it, it really does make a more of a swing in damage like the other abilities do in comparison to this one at least. I feel like that would be a nice way to adjust the ability, but also change the conduit so you don't just have a chance for you to gain an extra stack or extra tick of that ability, something more consistent, something more stronger, I guess. I feel like that would probably go a long way as well. And then we have the Nightfade Covenant. With the Nightfade Covenant, you get a pretty simple ability of Sepsis. Sepsis isn't a bad ability at all, and Nightfade right now, in before patch 9.1 or 9.05, is actually the Covenant that a lot of rogues play currently. Some of the soulbinds are really good, but Sepsis as an ability is also really not terrible, and it's also really simple to use. Some of the pros of this ability is it actually has very decent damage per execution. Like when you press it and it does its full duration, the damage for pressing one button is pretty high, especially in comparison to some of the other abilities in the game. This ability also does strongest tick of the damage of it during the last very tick when if the enemy survives your sepsis, so it'll be a massive puff of damage that has a bit of like this bursty potential to it. This ability also awards you 1 combo point, so that is something nice to mention. This ability has a pretty low cost of energy of only 25, so it's not super expensive or anything. If the target dies with your sepsis while the ability is on them, you actually get a reduction to its cooldown. So normally this ability is 1.5 minutes, so you'll shave off 30 seconds. However, at the end of sepsis, once you let the final tick do its damage, it actually will give you a chance to use one of your stealth abilities for 5 seconds. So it'll only give you one, so you can do sap, cheap shot, but most of you guys will be using it for shadow strikes as well as ambushes for PvE content. The conduit of this ability just makes sepsis do a bit more damage. It makes that dot tick, like the very first dot, do more damage, and then it's reduced every time it takes damage. So the damage over time component is basically just getting buffed with this septic shock conduit. If I had to mention some of the cons for this ability, is it's a pure single target ability, and there's no really interplay between single target or AoE. You can't really press Blade Flurry and hit an enemy with sepsis and put sepsis on multiple enemies or anything like that. So if you're looking for a ability that does multiple things, like, you know, hit multiple enemies at once, like the other two that we talked about, those are a little bit better for it. The stealth bar does kind of have a use for it, but very low. But if you're Assassination, it doesn't give you that free Garrote. For Assassination, I feel like if anything, it would have been great to get that stealthy Garrote. But if, let's say, I were to go Assassination right now, if you read the ability of Garrote, it does damage to an enemy over 18 seconds, silences the target for 6 seconds when used from stealth. And you also have the ability of Subterfuge, where if a Garrote is used in stealth, then will do 80% more damage. So normally your Garrote will do about 415 damage with that variance, of course. But if, let's say, you were to use Septic Shock and you were to let Sepsis run out completely so you can get the buff for a free finisher damage, once you get the sepsis buff, using Garrote doesn't actually consume this buff, and you can see your Garrote still does the same damage. However, consuming it on an ambush or cheap shot does consume sepsis, so you don't actually gain any kind of buff to Garrote, which is something that kind of sucks for rogues. So what I'm trying to say is the stealth ability you end up using doesn't actually have super crazy impact. It kind of lets you use a stealth ability, and it's cool that it's one of those abilities that does let you use but it doesn't fully like dip into it too much. It kind of dips a pinky for a second, but again, not super high impact. Some of the things that I noticed with this ability is one of the only abilities of Covenant stuff that actually plays with rogue poisons, as sepsis is treated as a poison and functions properly with like other poisons do. If you're playing Assassination and you use the Shiv ability, which makes you do more nature damage, sepsis is all poison, all nature damage. So in fact, it actually makes this ability do more damage. I'm surprised there isn't more interplay between poisons and this ability. I'm surprised that none of the other abilities really even try to make some kind of like a rogue poison. I mean, I guess we had Slaughter back in the day for Venthyr, but Slaughter got changed to Flagellation, so I guess that was kind of like a poison, but describe that idea completely. The ability plays with your stealth bar, which I think is really cool. Back in the day, it used to be a straight up Vanish, which gave you a variety of different bonuses. If you played the 100% crit Lego, that was 100% crit. If you played the Vanish Lego, where Vanish reduces the cooldown of your abilities, then you got the Vanish Lego buff too. And it actually had a lot more impact to it, but of course that was really strong, so they removed it. The cooldown reduction aspect of the Sepsis ability is kind of interesting. The fact that if you were to use it on an enemy that's about to fade and, dies before this ability gets its final iteration, has its cooldown reduced by 30 seconds. But for Sepsis, it's not really a aspect that's encouraged. It's kind of like if you use Sepsis on an enemy that is going to die, you'll get the cooldown a little bit faster. But there's nothing in the gameplay that really encourages you to use it on an enemy as like an execute in order to get the cooldown, in order to chain it from an enemy to enemy. So I have a couple different suggestions on how they could make Sepsis a bit more of an interesting ability. I think it's a poison ability, and what if it had a very familiar poison-based playstyle? Sepsis by itself does good damage, but what if you made it a bit more interesting? Kind of like the King's Bane ability back from Legion, the artifact weapon for Assassination rogues. Basically, it would do a poison, and every time you apply a poison on the enemy, you increase the damage of this ability. So it kind of lets you truck the enemy down. You would use the ability and then use an Envenom if you're Assassination for more poison applications. But I guess it would also work out without the rogues since Slice and Dice is back and everybody's using poisons again, where rogues basically training a single target down would increase the severity of the poison over time. Or maybe what if Blizzard were to change the way Sepsis plays and really play into its cooldown reduction aspect? I mean, I think it would be kind of cool, and maybe it would be really good for AoE fights. Kind of like a big execute mechanic for rogues, where the weaker the enemy is, the stronger this ability hits them. Maybe someone like anything above 30% health, this ability does plain damage like it does. But at lower targets, let's say below 30%, this ability has more of this execute potential. Maybe even encouraging a Mythic Plus playstyle where you kind of want to dot the enemies that are low or that are about to die. Maybe give it some crazy cooldown reduction aspect where if you do use it on the enemy and the enemy dies, you basically get this ability almost immediately. So it kind of encourages the rogues to like finish the job like an assassin would, kind of hoping to eliminate a key important target inside of a dungeon trash pack. And maybe they could even add a component for the Mythic Pluses where you are encouraged to want to use it as an execute, where let's say if you do use Sepsis and the enemy dies while they have Sepsis on him, have that enemy, let's say, explode with a big poison bomb full of poison damage, splash into nearby enemies. So as a rogue, you will kind of want to chain from one enemy to the next to the next. Potentially, they could also give more agency to this ability, and this is something I would do if they wanted to make it more unique or more intuitive to play. I like the aspect that it lets you dip into stealth, and I think it's cool. I think it's the only ability that literally lets you play with your stealth bar, if not stealth completely. So what if they made it, if anything, changed it where while Sepsis is on the enemy, you get access to one stealthy based ability to give players more agency, more control. I think this would be really good for PvE as well as PvP purposes, because, I mean, it would still play out the same way. You would use an ambush, but at least it will be an ambush when you want it, rather than trying to line up Sepsis and then waiting out its full duration of 10 seconds and then kind of trying to pre-plan 10 seconds ahead for when you might want to use a stealth ability in between. Give players more of that agency. While Sepsis is on a target, it gives you a buff where you can use one or maybe even a couple stealth-based abilities. I feel like there's so many cool things Sepsis does, and there's so many ways you can alter it. Maybe either play so heavily with poisons, or maybe play into the cooldown reduction aspect so much more, or maybe even just have an easier way to reach that stealth form bar thing while the ability is up. And those are some of the ways that I would potentially change it if I had the ability to. But those are at least some suggestions where I think would make this ability more interesting and maybe even high impact to your playstyle. Finally, we have the ability of Flagellation. So Flagellation is going through quite a few changes in 9.05 actually. So I feel like for this video, we should be talking about the 9.05 version of this ability, because March is approaching very soon, and the current version of Flagellation is far worse than this one. And I feel like if anything, we should be talking about the current version Flagellation that we'll be playing with very soon, because Blizzard actually made quite a few changes to it. Some of the pros of Flagellation is it can be lined up with common points for really decent burst of damage in the version of 9.05 that we will be talking about. This ability also grants you a haste buff at the end of its use, so when you use the ability and when it expires based on the common points you invest into finishers, it gives you quite a handy haste buff. This ability is also one of the few abilities that has 0 energy cost, so when you press it, you don't have to worry about your energy management whatsoever. I think this ability in 905 version, definitely in 905 compared to the current version, probably has the biggest swing damage. It all depends on how you build your character, what kind of buffs you have, do you have Bloodlust on, but if you can get a bunch of finishers while Flagellation is up, the damage you can provide could be actually pretty high. This ability also works with all finishers, as Flagellation, during it you need to use as many finishers as you can in order to do damage, but also to gain a haste buff. The finishers can be anything from Slice and Dice as well as Kid the Shot. All of it benefit towards the haste component as well as the damaging component of this ability. This ability can also work on AoE scenarios. So for example, if let's say you hit an enemy with Flagellation here, and then you end up spending calm points on a whole another enemy altogether, Flagellation will still have its damage buffed and damage components and the haste buff work even if you're not hitting the right target. For example, I'll turn on Blade Flurry. You can see the buff went from 17 to 20, so Flagellation will still keep functioning even if you're hitting a whole another target. The conduit of this ability also got changed in 905, so it's a bit different, but what it does is it basically gives you a little bit extra free damage at the very start. The ability itself is going to do more damage. It'll give you free damage checks when you use the ability and a bit of a head start in the haste buff. Some of the cons of Flagellation is the damage is going to be kind of low if you have 0 setup for it. So this ability doesn't just work like the others. You kind of have to have a bit more of an involved setup in order to really make this ability work. This ability is also very single target focused. While the other covenants have ability for at least to cleave with abilities or generate calm points of multiple abilities, this ability is purely single target focused. This ability also doesn't generate any common points. This is the first ability of all that actually generates 0 common points, where other abilities at least have an energy cost, but also generate a common point or a couple. This one generates neither, but also doesn't cost common points or energy either. Some of the things that I noted with this ability is the one ability of rogue abilities, I guess besides the Kyrian, that really does play into the finisher aspect, right? Sometimes rogues are all about common point building, sometimes they're all about spending. But Flagellation is the one ability that really rewards you for spending as many common points as you can really quickly. I feel like this ability has a naturally rewarding playstyle, at least the 905 version compared to the current version. The 905 version of this ability grants you a buff depending on how many finishers you use. So the game offers you a simple minigame to play, a simple mechanic of during this window, sink as many finishers with as many common points as you can, and it'll grant you the haste buff equal to up to a cap of the common points that you spent. So the more common points you spend, the more haste you get. The less common points you spend, the less haste you get. So it has a very simple reward structure, I guess, in a way. There's not too much I can really say for the suggestion for this ability, as it did get some changes with 905. So it's already getting improvements where it really needed with 902, which is the current patch that we're on right now. If anything, maybe Blizzard could do a thing where this ability has a way to maybe spread. Like, for example, kind of like a hungry vampire looking for a feeding frenzy. Kind of have Flagellation, let's say, be put on a target, and then you blast them full of finishers, and maybe have a residual Flagellation spread to nearby targets, where the rogue can then focus on that one target to keep spreading like AoE damage to enemies. So you could have some kind of like an AoE component for this ability. The AoE damage doesn't need to be high, because I feel like the single target damage in 905 at least seems quite big, and having any kind of residual damage that has some sort of AoE value could also maybe be somewhat interesting. Kind of make this ability kind of okay for cleave, not a great AoE ability, but have some sort of a cleave component to it. But then again, this ability is pretty new in 905. I feel like needs to be more people to play with this ability, see the ability, experience it. So we'll probably get a lot more feedback on how it functions, what are the flaws, what are the benefits of this specific ability as we go on forward into 905. Once we are in the new patch, once we have all these new changes and updates available and everything. So it's going to be interesting to see how players will perceive this ability and what they will say, and if there are any flaws that maybe I or other people that have been testing this ability might have missed, or other ways that can use this ability to be more improved. There's probably a lot more to do. I just can't think of anything right now since it just recently got changes, and the changes make it look so much better than the original version. But that's going to be my video, guys, on how I would adjust any of the Rogue Covenant abilities. The abilities specifically themselves, not really the conduits or the soulbinds or nothing, but rather the abilities themselves for potential 9.1. I like the idea that all of our rogue abilities are pretty low impact. It makes it so that you can play whatever covenant you want to, and it doesn't really matter too much. With the event tier buffs coming out in 905, I think it's going to make the covenants even closer to one another. You'll still have certain covenants that are slightly ahead of each other, but that slight difference will be I don't know if it'll be enough for players to want to re-roll to one covenant or another, but it'll give more players the opportunity, if anything, to play what they truly like, based by the mods or the abilities or whatever it may be. So I like how rogue abilities are low impact because of the freedom that it offers, but if you were to change them in any meaningful way, I think you would have to make these abilities more high impact, and those are some of the ideas that I've had in terms of how I would go about making these abilities high impact. These ideas are probably not perfect by any measure. I'm kind of just trying to think of different ways that you could play them in order to emphasize some of the strengths every single covenant ability brings, and finding ways to emphasize some of the playstyles, because a lot of the other covenant abilities for classes have very specific cool things, but rogue abilities are so low impact that you ignore the minigames or you ignore the damage and you use them for other purposes, like Bone Spike not really used for damage but rather to buff allies, or the Kieran ability ignoring the minigame completely in order to just do damage. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what Blizzard ends up doing in 9.1. But I'm pretty sure we're going to get some changes here and there. I think most of the changes are going to be with the conduits and maybe the soul binds, but I feel like rogues are going to be left alone for the most part, as a lot of our abilities in terms of covenant changes are simming so close to each other that maybe that's exactly what Blizzard wants, for one covenant to not really feel like it's miles ahead of others, and maybe that's a good thing going forward in the future. But thank you guys so much for checking out this video. You let me know your thoughts about all these ideas that I have, or if you have any ideas of your own, feel free to note them down in the comments below. But those have been some of my ideas of what I think they could do to make our abilities for covenants a little bit more interesting, potentially in 9.1. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in another one.